Good morning, everyone. The hearing will get underway. Senator Grassley is much recovered, but is not here for the hearing this morning. Senator Johnson has been kind enough to fill in for him. We send our very best wishes to Chuck as he continues to get better, and we'll see him back here in fighting form in short order, I am sure. Today's hearing, I want to welcome the witnesses. We have a very, very good panel, and this is part of a series of hearings on the economic and budgetary costs of climate change that press the point that caring about debt and deficits requires caring about climate change, from creeping climate inflation to looming systemic risks. Families, communities, and the federal government will bear, and indeed are already bearing, the costs of upheaval in the world's climate. For our 13th hearing in this series, we highlight the threats of massive carbon pollution to our oceans, threats which in turn affect both coastal, obviously, and also inland communities. The threat to oceans is profound and often not well recognized. They absorb 25% of all carbon dioxide emissions, which makes them more acidic, and they absorb more than 90% of the excess heat generated by these emissions, making them heat up. The numbers are immense. Scientists measure how fossil fuel emissions are heating up our oceans in zettajoules. A zettajoule is a joule, the standard unit of heat energy measure, with 21 zeros behind it. It is a fearsomely big number. For a sense of practical scale, the total energy consumption of all humankind, all around the world, of every form, sums up to just 1/2 of a zettajoule per year. And yet, for the price of the fossil fuel component of that 1/2 zettajoule of energy for humankind, our oceans are absorbing about 14 zettajoules of excess heat every year. That is the heat equivalent of 7 Hiroshima bombs detonating every second of every day in the oceans. 7 atom bombs every second, every day, year after year. It is a colossal heat load. Were it not for oceans absorbing all that excess CO2 and all that excess heat, the U.S. would likely be already largely unlivable in many areas. Oceans have saved us. But absorbing all those emissions and all the heat is not without consequence. The heat is raising the temperature of our oceans, causing sea levels to rise, both by thermal expansion of seawater and by added runoff from melting glaciers and ice sheets. As a result, a shadow looms over coastal communities and their blue economies. Today, 40% of all Americans live along the coast. If American coastal counties were aggregated into their own country, it would be the 3rd highest GDP country in the world. In these communities, and for the entire U.S. economy, marine industries are an engine of economic growth. They employ nearly 2.3 million workers and contribute more than $430 billion to overall GDP. Ocean economies face particular risk, obviously, from climate changes. In 2021, commercial and recreational fishing contributed almost $140 billion to the U.S. economy, but fisheries are being harmed by warming ocean temperatures. Fish populations are relocating away to cooler waters. And economists estimate that direct economic losses could reach almost $1 billion annually by 2100. Downstream effects in fish processing and fisheries-based tourism will make it worse. One example, impacts to Alaskan snow crab fisheries have caused one town's revenues to drop over 90%. Ocean-based tourism and recreation add $275 billion each year to the U.S. economy and, of course, are important to Rhode Island. Yet huge swaths of American beaches are likely to disappear in the not-too-distant future. And scuba diving, snorkeling, and eco-tours businesses struggle as local wildlife face existential threats from climate change. Coral reefs, for instance, are bleaching and dying, and oceans are acidifying, making it worse. And not many people want to come and see a bleached and crumbling dead reef. In Florida, water temperatures reached hot tub level this past summer, 101 degrees. Not great for ocean life. Rising ocean temperatures also cause more intense storms that are causing enormous and enormously costly damage. On top of the physical damage, the storms shut down travel and tourism until storm-hit communities can rebuild. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, military bases, and ports are in increased jeopardy. And when critical infrastructure is lost, local economies suffer. And the federal government often has to foot the bill. Here we connect to our insurance hearings and the testimony that sea level rise has the potential to trigger cascading economy-wide economic catastrophes. One of our witnesses will testify that sea level projections will prove to be substantial underestimates if we trigger destabilization and collapse of the Greenland or West Antarctic ice sheets. Cross these tipping points, and the danger dramatically increases. The added sea level rise of crossing those tipping points will inundate additional hundreds of billions of dollars of real estate, and that makes properties in that bigger risk zone harder to insure. What you can't insure, you can't mortgage, and that can trigger a predicted crash in coastal property values. The market will have to adjust abruptly to a new realization that the useful life of billions of dollars in property will end way sooner than expected, setting off a series of dangerous economic cascades. We saw in 2008 how trouble in the mortgage market cascaded out into the broader economy. The writing is on the wall for a climate-fueled repeat. We are actually seeing the early stages of just such a trajectory in the Florida insurance market right now. The thing about economic crises is that they come on slowly until they come on fast, and then they can come on very fast indeed. You've heard the warnings, you've seen the witnesses, they were serious grown-ups, expert in their fields. The early evidence of their warnings coming true is already visible. It's time for us to wake up. And with that, I'll turn to Senator Johnson for the ranking member opening remarks, and then I'll introduce the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I certainly wish Senator Grassley a full and speedy recovery. The good news is he is back voting, but just not recovered to the extent to serve as ranking member, so I'm happy to read his opening statement, which starts, Mr. Chairman, the Houthis are firing Iranian missiles at American ships in the Gulf of Aden. They're disrupting global supply chains, forcing international cargo vessels to sail for days around the Cape of Good Hope. Meanwhile, they're giving Chinese and Russians easy access to the Suez Canal. Instead of discussing the most pressing fiscal or maritime issues, Democrats have elected to hold an ocean warming hearing to scare people about climate change, their 14th climate change hearing. This hearing will be similar to those prior. Democrats cite extreme statistics, attempting to justify their climate alarm. Republicans counter with sober facts showing that while climate change poses real challenges, Armageddon isn't around the corner. Human ingenuity and adaptation are the primary answers. Democrats argue for even more climate spending. Republicans note that we can't afford the spending we already have. We point to the impact of inflation and crushing debt on the American people, and how our exploding debt will restrict our ability to respond to future challenges, whether from climate change, war, or economic disaster. Democrats attempt to make a case for climate destruction. Republicans counter with the sober reality of a slightly warming globe, while we've also been just through a record Arctic freeze in much of the nation with over 90 people dying from the cold. As Senator Grassley has said repeatedly, climate change is a problem worthy of our attention. If Democrats want to discuss budgetary proposals related to climate change, we can have that debate. But it's clear they don't. They prefer to spread climate alarm rather than face our fiscal reality, a reality that nonpartisan experts of the Congressional Budget Office and the Government Accountability Office say is, quote, unsustainable, unquote. Today, Democrats will claim that climate change will decimate the ocean economy. The truth is that climate change is a real challenge, but nothing we can't overcome. We don't have oceans in Iowa, but we depend on them to get our goods to market. Global supply chains have proven to be resilient in the face of many obstacles. However, pressing geopolitical risk make trade difficult and more expensive. At a hearing earlier this month on climate risks for municipal bond issuers, witnesses on both sides of the aisle informed us climate change would not upend the municipal bond market. We look forward to a similar dose of clarity from Dr. Levy and Dr. Fraser, and we welcome all of today's witnesses. I'll only add that I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not a climate change alarmist. The Chairman mentioned testimony before this committee. Well, one of the testimonies was we spent about $5 trillion globally combating climate change. I've asked witnesses, well, have we made a dent in it? Have we moved the curve down? You throw on top of that the Inflation Reduction Act, the $400 billion of, I would say, green energy boondoggle spending. Goldman Sachs actually said that'll cost more like $1.2 trillion. So now we got about $6.2 trillion. That's a real economic impact. And I would say we haven't seen any benefit from it whatsoever because I don't think there's anything we can do to hold back the tides. But again, looking forward to the testimony and entering the discussion.
Let me welcome the witnesses. First is Dr. Andrea Dutton. Dr. Dutton is a professor in the Department of Geoscience at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a geologist and paleoceanographer who is regarded as an international expert on the study of past climate and sea level change. She is also a MacArthur Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and a Fellow of the Geological Society of America. Our second witness is Dr. Rashid Soumaila. Dr. Soumaila is a professor and research chair of ocean and fisheries economics at the University of British Columbia. He specializes in bioeconomics and marine ecosystem valuation and is one of the most internationally recognized interdisciplinary ocean economists. His work has led to several prestigious awards, including the 2023 Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, often described as the Nobel Prize for the Environment. Our third witness is Kyle Schaefer, a lifelong professional in the outdoor and fishing industry. For the past 15 years, Mr. Schaefer has built a fishing charter business in the southern coast of Maine and also founded and operates a fly fishing lodge in the Bahamas and takes his clients fishing in many different locations around the U.S. and the world. As I told him earlier, he has the life many of us dream of. Following Mr. Schaefer is Dr. Thomas Fraser, professor and dean of the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida. Dr. Fraser's research addresses interdisciplinary environmental topics pertaining to water quantity and quality, nutrient dynamics, biogeochemical processes, and ecological restoration of degraded ecosystems. He previously served as a member of the U.S. EPA's Oil Spill Research Strategy Review Panel. Our final witness is Dr. Phil Levy, chief economist at Flexport, which focuses on supply chain management and logistics. During the Bush administration, Dr. Levy served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors as senior economist for trade and as a member of the policy planning staff for the U.S. Department of State. Thank you all for joining us today. You each have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony, which in its full form will be made a matter of record in these proceedings. Dr. Dutton.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Johnson, and committee members for inviting me to speak today. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am a geologist and paleoceanographer who conducts research on past climate and sea level change using marine sediments. I'm here to report that human-driven climate change is rapidly altering our oceans and marine ecosystems, threatening not only our economy, but humanity itself. Climate change that is driven primarily by the burning of fossil fuels poses formidable challenges to maintain the health of our oceans and coastlines. This impacts wide range of economic, cultural, environmental, and social interests. Climate impacts on the oceans have major repercussions for marine life, including marine heat waves that are increasing in frequency and intensity, more acidic seawater as the carbon dioxide that we pump into the atmosphere gets absorbed by the oceans, and lower levels of oxygen in seawater. Some additional impacts on the oceans include changes in ocean currents that impact weather patterns extending far inland, warmer oceans that fuel more intense hurricanes and can lead to rapid intensification of those hurricanes before they make landfall, and accelerating rates of sea level rise and coastal inundation. These are just a few examples, but they give a flavor of the profound and far-reaching impacts of climate change on the oceans, marine life, and human life that will produce knock-on effects for our coastal and national budgets and economies. One of these impacts is on coral reefs, home to 25% of marine life. These ecosystems are important for fisheries, tourism, food availability, shoreline protection, and coastal economies, but are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat. Extreme heat can cause corals to bleach and die, as we saw this year in Florida and have seen at reefs around the globe. The burning of fossil fuels is increasing the frequency of marine heat waves and leaving mass mortality of corals in its wake. Coral reefs are actually central to my research on past sea level change. Corals live near the sea surface because they need the light to survive, so we use them to track the position of sea level through time. Our studies of past warming episodes reveal that sea level can experience sudden jumps as ice sheets melt. These ice sheets also have certain thresholds or tipping points beyond which melting becomes irreversible on human timescales. There is considerable evidence that portions of the West Antarctic ice sheet may be near such a tipping point, whereby the grounded ice margin could retreat past the ledge of the deep basin in which it sits, causing the ice sheet to become unstable and retreat rapidly down this slope. Both data and modeling suggest that some of these thresholds for rapid melting of the Greenland and Antarctica ice sheets are somewhere between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming and could commit us to tens of feet of sea level rise. For reference, last year warming reached 1.4 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline. The presence of these tipping points and the potential for sudden jumps in sea level as ice sheets retreat means that if we are relying on mean projections of future sea level rise to estimate risk, then we will be unprepared for the much greater damages when such events unfold. The 7 worst years of ice loss have all occurred in the last decade. If the recent observed acceleration of ice loss in Greenland continues, it will track above the upper range projected by the IPCC for this decade. In other words, above the central estimate. As this committee has heard at previous hearings, risk management means planning for high-risk outcomes and not assuming that the central case scenarios will occur as bad as they already are. Greater than expected sea level rise caused by ice sheet tipping points would be catastrophic for more than just the communities along the coastline. To be clear, we cannot just adapt to climate change. My testimony highlights ways in which marine life is already reaching thresholds of survival. While climate change may seem like a gradual and slow-moving problem, once we cross critical thresholds, the impacts can be sudden, widespread, and devastating. Because risks increase with every increment of warming, the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. The most important part of my message today is that because humans are driving the rapid warming of our planet, this is good news. It means we are also the solution to the problem. Our climate future is not written in stone. It's not just a place we get to go to. It's a place we get to create together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Dutton. Dr. Sumaila.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Johnson, and committee members for inviting me to speak today. It is a privilege and an honor. My name is Dr. Rashid Sumaila, and I'm a University Killam professor and Canada researcher in interdisciplinary ocean and fisheries economics at the University of British Columbia. I have just a few points that I would like to share with the committee. The first one is from our research. I think all Americans should care about the ocean and the life it holds. Even people who don't live by the coast, even the 60% of Americans who don't live by the coast. Why do I say that? Because our lives are intertwined connected to the ocean, as it provides us with valuable resources, and I don't have the time to tell you all here. Just on the fish alone, the ocean contributes significantly to our global food supply. Through international trade, everyone, all Americans get to eat nutritious, healthy seafood, which is good for our health, right? And globally, commercial ocean fisheries catch about 120 million tons of fish a year. And these fisheries generate about $240 billion in worldwide revenue for fishers each year, which translates into economy-wide impacts of roughly $600 billion annually. The ocean provides job security, generating income for an estimated 260 million people worldwide. I keep saying worldwide because we're all connected, right? America to the world. And note that these numbers don't even include recreational fisheries and shark watching and whale watching. Now, in the U.S., and the chair has given out some numbers, I have numbers that are quite similar. In 2020, commercial and recreational saltwater fishing alone generated over $250 billion in sales impact, which describes the total economic sales of fish as it passes through the food value chain into our plates, for example. So lots of dollars, and the contribution to America's GDP is estimated to be over $110 billion a year, right? Which supports 1.7 million Americans, the jobs in the marine sector. Huge benefits to everybody. This is just the fish. So not addressing climate change will lead to losses in this. Remember, no fish, all of these are gone. So we need to protect the fish, and climate change is a big threat to that, as we heard from my colleague. In a recent paper, we explored the effect of climate change on Atlantic cod, yellowtail flounder, and Pacific halibut, 3 important species. And they are shared between Canada and the US, so they are jointly managed. What we found is that the fish available as climate change escalates will be shrinking. There will be less fish to catch. But even more importantly for the U.S., the proportion of the profit to Canada and the U.S. changes because the fish move up, right? So Canada's profitability will increase from the current 39% for Atlantic cod to 65%. So a big disadvantage for the U.S. And in the case of yellowtail flounder, we see something similar. Canadians will get more profit. 76% of the profits will turn to Canada rather than the current 68%. In the case of Pacific halibut, we see relatively stable profitability, mainly because of the nature of halibut and its distribution. So, and this is we see this rarely in the analysis we do. There is another study which I will put in the written statement that you can see lots of losses for North America and the U.S. I want to conclude by restating that the U.S. has a lot to lose as climate change continues to grow. Consumers, businesses will face financial losses if they want to continue to consume and provide the same quality and quantity of fish as climate change escalates. By reducing the effects of climate change, the U.S. will achieve what I have come to call infinity fish, the idea that Americans will have the possibility to continue to eat nutritious, healthy protein forever, and therefore achieving infinity benefits. So I thank you again for the opportunity to testify and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Schaefer.
Greetings, Senator Whitehouse, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. It's truly an honor to be here as a business person, an angler, a captain, a father, and a firsthand witness to our changing climate. I'm a fishing guide from Maine, and I founded and own a fishing lodge in the Bahamas. Additionally, my work brings me to places across the country and the world to experience the best angling destinations. My businesses succeed only because of thriving, healthy ecosystems and relatively predictable climate patterns. Unfortunately, in large part due to climate change, our oceans are now desperately lacking stability, balance, and the abundance that we rely on. The climate trends of more frequent and increasingly severe weather events like extreme heat, wildfire, hurricanes, heavy rains, high tide flooding, and marine heat waves pose a significant increase in risk and weaken my confidence in a prosperous future for my fishing businesses. Any one of these events can ruin my week, my day, an entire season with enduring effects on the fisheries where I make my living. My family and I are being forced to have serious conversations, challenging ones, about diversifying away from our ocean-based livelihood. Put simply, we're searching for something that we can rely on. As I position my boat searching for striped bass, foreign fish now cross my bow that I've never seen in my home waters in Maine before. Species that are typically found south of the Gulf of Maine, like Atlantic bonito and black sea bass, are becoming common sights. With black sea bass quickly adapting their range northward, they're gorging on baby lobsters, competing with other species, and causing major impact on the ecosystem's balance. Striped bass, which in 2019 were estimated to contribute $7.7 billion a year to our economy, are intensely affected by climate change. 5 consecutive years of failed spawning events in the Chesapeake Bay due to low water flows and warm winters has left the stock on the brink of collapse. Striped bass, just like my businesses, require some stability to survive. I may be forced to close my charter business within the next few seasons simply because there won't be enough fish left. I also never thought that fires blazing in the western U.S. would impact my business, almost 2,000 miles away on the Maine coast, but in 2020, a haze of smoke blanketed the skies, eliminating the opportunity to sight fish. As a result, I canceled trips and lost revenue. The 2023 fires in Quebec provided a similar challenge, but this time, poor air quality and the smell of charred pines and hardwoods filled our lungs and burned our eyes. In the southeast U.S. and the Bahamas, hurricanes have become more frequent, stronger, and occur over a longer season. Weather events increasingly disrupt our supply chain, complicating the already challenging task of operating a remote fishing lodge. During the fall of 2023, I canceled more trips than ever, and as a result of extreme weather. As hurricanes roll through, they don't just inflict damage on homes and businesses, they destroy vital fish-rearing habitat like mangrove forests and seagrass beds where 75% of commercially harvested fish spend some part of their life cycle. Major coral bleaching events in Florida, the Bahamas, and Cuba were observed during the summer of 2023 as an intense record-breaking marine heat wave suffocated thousands of reefs. These key habitats are essential to support the almost $10 billion Florida fishing industry. As a guide and lodge operator that spends almost every day outside and on the water, climate change and its impacts on my business and our natural environment is in my face daily. I can't hide from it. I dream of passing healthy businesses down to my almost 3-year-old son one day. I want to be proud of what we leave to future generations. This is why I'm here in front of you today, to allow you to see climate impact through my eyes and encourage decisive action to secure a fishable and profitable future. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion here today.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Sorry, Mr. Schaefer. Now, Dr. Fraser.
All right. Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As you know, my name is Tom Fraser. I'm a professor and I'm Dean of the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida and serve also as the Executive Director of the Florida Flood Hub for Applied Research and Innovation. In 2019, I had the honor to testify about how climate change affects oceans before the Environment Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and my position has not changed. Climate change and its associated detrimental effects are real. Emissions from human activities are largely responsible, and managing our collective global behavior is the most effective and practical way to address the fundamental cause. But today's hearing focuses on one key facet of climate change: ocean warming. Oceanic temperatures increase because atmospheric temperatures rise due to heat that is trapped by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. These relationships are well established. What may not be fully appreciated, however, is that no matter what we do today to reduce emissions and stabilize mean global air temperatures, the ocean will continue to warm well into the next century and beyond, which will generate numerous challenges. Given this outlook and my professional background, I want to focus on science, or how science can help us to deal with the challenges on two sectors: fisheries as a representative of the natural environment, and flooding as an example for the built environment. Among the challenges facing fisheries, I'll focus on two: altered ranges and altered habitats. As the ocean warms, some warm water species can expand their ranges northward, but some cold water species will be forced to contract their ranges. Thus, the location and size of catches for commercial and recreational fishers will change. As the ocean warms, we will also see changes in habitats. For example, warmer water stresses inshore structural habitats such as seagrasses and corals that provide food and shelter for many fishery species. So what should our response be? Well, our management of fisheries needs to broaden from single species management to ecosystem management. And ecosystem management considers the changing temperature, but along with other physical, chemical, and biological components of the environment and their interactions. Our management of habitat needs to include increased protection from pollution, freshwater runoff, and other stressors under our control so that the habitats have the best chance of coping with warming water. We should also be prepared to restore habitats if needed, which includes developing new techniques for culturing and transplanting replacement organisms, exploring genetics to identify more tolerant strains, and organizing supply chains that operate at the necessary spatial scales. In terms of flooding, I'll focus on compound flooding. And compound flooding results from intense precipitation putting water on the land and higher sea levels inhibiting that water from draining. Warming oceans contribute to both components because warmer water expands, leading to higher sea level, and warmer water fuels wetter storms. So what should we do here? We have access to a variety of actions that allow us to mitigate or adapt to flooding, such as seawalls, floodgates, raised structures, and improved drainage or improved water conveyance systems. All of these solutions, however, have cost, so that determining how much investment is needed is a key issue. An accurate assessment of risk, or in other words, the magnitude and likelihood of various levels of flooding, promotes optimal investment in adaptation and mitigation. Currently, our projections of future conditions rely heavily on global climate models that are driven, in large part by changes in the atmospheric temperature. These global climate models are complex, and they function best at large temporal and spatial scales. Considerable uncertainty surrounds our efforts to downscale these long-term global changes in sea level and precipitation to projections of risk at temporal and spatial scales that are needed for optimal planning. National and state agencies and organizations have key roles to play because they have the charters and expertise to successfully translate global insights into useful and usable local insights. Improved projections will help us employ existing solutions optimally and highlight the need for innovative approaches moving forward. So is anything currently happening? Yes, and I'm just going to provide two quick examples. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and Regional Fishery Management Councils are expanding their efforts to apply ecosystem management that recognizes that the climate is changing. And in terms of flooding, the state of Florida is funding the Florida Flood Hub for Applied Research and Innovation, which is coordinating experts from multiple organizations to tailor sea level rise and precipitation projections for Florida to guide planning and actions that increase resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frazee. Dr. Levy.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd like to address two topics in my testimony. First, how we might think about the topic of supply chain resilience. Second, the implications of the U.S. fiscal situation for adopting measures that could enhance supply chain resilience. It's my hope that, in combination, these two topics will lead us to the right cost-benefit questions to ask about potential climate measures to address ocean supply chain resilience. Increasing the resilience of supply chains has been a major policy goal in the wake of the disruptions and inflation of recent years. But what exactly does it mean? At a simple level, we could take this as the ability of the supply chain to deliver the goods and inputs that American business and consumers want or need, but that rather begs the question. In the ocean supply chain business, there are capacity constraints. The capacity of factories, the availability of ships and containers, the size of ports, the speed at which those ports can process containers and move them to other modes of transport, such as trucking or rail, and the ability of warehouses to store the goods. There are two key constraints that limit resilience. The first is that it's costly to purchase capacity that's unlikely to be used. The second is that adjustments take time. Any decision to expand ports, rearrange rail, build warehouses, or purchase new ships can take months or even years to carry out. A resilient supply chain will be able to handle fluctuations in demand and interruptions to supply within a normal range. However, when we move beyond that normal range, we're likely to see strains. So how do we think about the COVID-era shipping crisis, when prices for moving containers across oceans quintupled or went higher than that, and delivery times elongated substantially? In short, it was a period where we saw demand move well above its normal range. While there were indisputably instances in which factories or port terminals or other links in supply chains were disrupted by disease or disease prevention measures, the net effect was a very substantial expansion of supply, which points towards a demand shock as the culprit. Quantities increased substantially, whether we measure this by U.S. personal consumption expenditures on goods or whether we look at real imports into the United States. The spikes in income and consumption that drove this expanded demand correlate very well with fiscal stimulus measures and came at a time of negative real interest rates, a feature of highly expansionary monetary policy. Of course, we do have clear instances of supply shocks playing the dominant role. At this very moment, as Senator Johnson alluded to, supply chains are being impeded by missile threats in the Red Sea and also by the effects of drought in the Panama Canal. With these potential challenges in hand, there are a range of some categories of remedies, perhaps three that we could look at. You can either try to limit the frequency and magnitude of shocks, you can try expanding supply chain capacity, or you could try enhancing the efficiency and flexibility of supply chains. I'd be happy to return to the relative merits of each, but all require a cost-benefit analysis. Given the topic of today's hearing, I would note that this cost-benefit can be particularly difficult in the case of climate investments. If, for example, the U.S. were to invest $1 billion in climate amelioration today, can we quantify how much this would reduce the probability of, say, droughts that limit the operation of the Panama Canal? Then, even if we were to have that number, what is the marginal benefit of a better functioning canal given the existence of workarounds, such as shipping to the U.S. West Coast and distributing across the country by truck or rail, or perhaps transporting some goods by air? However difficult, such an analysis is particularly important in the current U.S. fiscal situation, with highly elevated debt to GDP and structural concerns about the budget deficit. By that last point, I mean the persistence of substantial deficits even in periods of positive real GDP growth as we have had since the beginning of 2021. These considerations lend support to supply chain resilience measures that place a relatively smaller dent in the public purse. So to conclude, supply chain resilience involves the ability to deal with significant shifts in supply or demand for global shipping, which takes place heavily on oceans. Shocks can come to either demand, as in the pandemic-era surge in goods consumption, or to supply, the current situation in the Red Sea. It's a fundamentally difficult problem because excess capacity is costly, adjustment takes time, and extraordinary surges will always be difficult to deal with. Fortunately, there are measures that can be undertaken by governments to limit these shocks, and by both governments and the private sector working together to enhance supply chain efficiency. In the interests of time, let me stop on that more optimistic note, and I would welcome any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. Let me particularly thank Mr. Schaefer for his hands-on experience and the testimony that he brought here. I'll share with you that a friend who's a Rhode Island fishing captain has said to me, a guy who started on his grandfather's boat, Sheldon, this is not my grandfather's ocean anymore. Things are getting weird out there. And that seems to align very much with your experience in Maine. We too are seeing black sea bass moving up through Rhode Island waters without appropriate adjustment in the fishing regulations to track that move. We've seen our lobster fishery essentially disappear. We used to have a fishery for something called winter flounder. That is gone. It's now bycatch. So your stories of what is happening in Maine are true for us in Rhode Island as well. I'd also add that I made a trip to Florida to look at climate issues down there some time ago and met with the mayor, Republican mayor of Monroe County, which is the southernmost county, I believe, in Florida. And I asked her about the reefs. And she said, they're beautiful, unless you were here 10 years ago. So we are seeing these dramatic changes, and I just wanted to validate your experience with the experience that I've encountered from people who are actually directly involved. Dr. Dutton, in Rhode Island, we've got a thing called Storm Tools. It's a very, very well developed storm coastal flooding risk assessment tool run by the Coastal Resources Management Council, our CZMA agency. It operates off of NOAA data. But it sounds like it's your testimony that the averaging effect, the mean that we look at in sea level rise predictions could be dramatically off by very considerable feet of sea level rise, and that we will find that out fairly suddenly. Is that accurate, and would you elaborate?
Yes, that is accurate. So part of my testimony is that if we rely on this central estimate, we will most likely be underestimating what will actually happen. That's for a couple different reasons. Part of it is the nature that the reports or the guidance that is provided is done by consensus. So what can we all in this room as scientists agree upon how much sea level is going to rise? And no one wants to seem like an alarmist, right, which is a term that Senator Johnson brought up a few minutes ago. Say, well, this is what we're really certain, it's going to rise this much. But we know there are these tipping points there. It's more a question of when rather than if. If we keep warming the oceans, we will reach those tipping points. But because the models are not very good yet at telling us exactly when that is going to happen, it's hard for us to fold that in, and so we have less certainty. So it doesn't fall within that central estimate. So this is a fundamental problem in the way this information is communicated and then implemented, and then risk is assessed, because the economists are going to be using those central estimates that we provide, right? Which indeed are underestimates. So that hopefully explains your question.
And if you take it to the shore, Dr. Fraser, you said that there is considerable uncertainty as to how the large-scale predictions of sea level rise can be drilled down to what you called local insights. That uncertainty creates a fairly significant problem for the insurance industry, doesn't it?
So I'm an ecologist or an ecosystem scientist, and I just want to preface my comment here by saying that, you know, what my goal is to provide the science that allows people to evaluate risk, you know, and that's the magnitude of the threat,
Yeah.
right, and the probability that it will occur.
Okay, well, I'll leave that then, but I do extend my sympathies to Florida and what is going on down there in the insurance markets, which seem to be very distressed. And having lived through a couple of insurance crises in Rhode Island, I see the early signs of the market swirling the drain. Dr. Ciamella, what do you think are the climate tipping points or the climate risks that are most likely to do serious damage to the fisheries supply chain, and how?
Yeah, is it okay? Yeah. In my written report, I talk about the four, what do I call them, the deadly quartet, the deadly four, and this has been mentioned by my colleagues here. The first is that the warming is taking place. Because of the warming, fish, like every living thing, when the conditions are difficult, you try to move, right? Those that can move with the cool water, and we see that happening. And those that can't perish. And we're seeing the more the temperature rises, the more we're going to get closer to a tipping point. And in some places, we're actually seeing some of these things happen, where fish that were plentiful are gone, partly because of climate change, plus overfishing the two and pollution, right? So you have that. The second thing is acidification, and this worries me a lot, ocean acidification, because you see the fish are moving towards the poles, and the Arctic is actually known to be the hotspot for ocean acidification because of all the changes that are happening. So here is fish moving from southern Florida because it's hot to the Arctic, and then they get to the Arctic, they mean acidification. So from hot boiling water to acidic water, just think about that. And then you have deoxygenation. The processes are actually reducing the oxygen in the ocean. And the Pacific coast is a hotspot of that. So we face that. No oxygen, no life, right? This applies to fish too. Finally, you have the sea level rise, which really knocks off so much. So this all pushes us towards a tipping point.
I'll turn to Senator Johnson, but I'd add just one observation, because I've been looking at this for a long time. It was maybe most of a decade ago that scientists went out into the waters off the Pacific Northwest, and they looked at the pteropod, which is a tiny snail that swims and operates in the pelagic environment. And it is a very, very important food source for the ocean food chain. And they, in their sampling, I think found that 50% of the pteropods had exhibited what they called moderate to severe shell damage from the acidification out there. And of course, if you take a foundational part of the fishery's food chain and it collapses because the little creature can't make a shell properly any longer and therefore can't survive in that acidified environment, then the whole rest of the, I think Dr. Dutton would probably call it trophic cascade, falls down as well. So just another point of data. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start out with an observation myself. I have not observed a reluctance toward climate alarmism. I think it's readily available and out there. I've actually got a couple pages of just dire predictions that just never came true, which is kind of a problem for climate alarmists. They've been alarming people for decades, whether it's global cooling, global warming, sea level rise, taking over cities. It hasn't panned out. That being said, again, I don't deny climate change. It always has, always will change. Don't deny the impact you're talking about on the oceans. I'm concerned about the same thing. I hate to see the destruction of coral reefs, the disruption of fisheries, that type of thing. My point, my question is, what can we realistically do about it? Again, in testimony, we heard that we've spent about $5 trillion so far combating climate change. Also heard in testimony from the majority witnesses when I asked, does anybody really think that India and China are going to stop burning fossil fuels? Not only do they say, no, that's not going to happen, neither will we. So that's just the reality of the situation. I would say it's actually immoral to ask less developed countries not to power their populations out of poverty. I guess we can sit back here and go, yeah, we can afford, a 25, 30, 50% increase in power to, move toward green energy. People impoverished in China and in India can't, and they won't. So my point always is, what can we honestly do about it? Dr. Levy, you're the economist here. Do you think it's a moral thing to do to impose green energy on China and India? And by the way, do you think it's even possible?
Could you put your mic on, sir?
Yes, sorry about that. I said we would be in a difficult situation if we're turning to economists for moral guidance, but I think you raise a very good point, which is that when you have global problems, if we're looking at the efficacy, it's going to differ dramatically whether we're able to do global solutions or local solutions, which may then get overwhelmed. And I would say the degree of cooperation on these issues with emerging countries has not been especially high. It's high when it comes to making pledges for the distant future, less so when it comes to implementing measures. And I think that is a serious concern.
Again, I remain a skeptic in terms of, the total impact. But again, it sounds like this panel's pretty solid with that, so I don't want to argue the point. I will point out somebody like Bjorn Lomborg, who I think is on your side in terms of man-made climate change, also says that we shouldn't spend a dime on it because with limited resources, and we have limited resources, there are far more effective ways to alleviate human suffering. And we should focus on that. And, Dr. Fraser, that kind of sounds like your approach to this thing is, okay, what can we actually do? Why don't you speak to that issue?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to, again, preface my response in a couple of ways, right? I think that everybody on this panel would recognize that, as I said before in my testimony, that climate change is real and, it's a concern with a lot of potential impacts. But we're seeing real effects now. And so, and it's important to figure out how we're going to spend our limited resources. I'm a scientist, not a policymaker or an appropriator, right? But I do recognize that our resources are limited and they're difficult decisions to make. And so what I like to do in my profession is to provide credible information that allows people like yourselves to make informed decisions about should we invest in, a higher bridge, a higher road, an improved water conveyance system or stormwater systems so that we we better protect the livelihoods of people in my state, for example, in Florida, right? But at the end of the day, if we don't address the issue of increasing emissions, we will continue to deal and grapple with increased temperatures both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, which will, make it more difficult with time. But again, I appreciate and recognize that resources are limited, right? And hopefully we can provide you the best information possible to spend those resources in a wise manner.
Okay, and we're not in a position to bend China and India to our will.
So again, what I would say in that regard, it's a global problem, right? And I think that it's all of our responsibility as a society to work to a common solution.
Thank you.
As Senator Kaine settles in, I'll take a minute of chairman time to say that we actually are in a position to put very strong encouragements on China and India and other heavily carbon-intensive polluting countries. And in fact, it's happening right now through carbon border tariff work. The European Union has passed the CBAM into law, its carbon border adjustment mechanism that is underway. The United Kingdom has announced that it will be joining the EU into a common tariff platform. That is estimated to put enormous pressure on China to clean up its act. And I'm encouraging the U.S. to join in that. And Senators Cassidy and Graham and Coons and I and a few others are working on a bipartisan carbon tariff proposal that we could try to pass here in the United States Congress. When it's free to pollute, polluters will pollute. When there's a very significant tariff charge for being a big carbon polluter, that puts a very significant economic incentive. And I think those economic incentives will do much better than the moral suasion and efforts to work cooperatively that we've undertaken so far. So I personally am a big fan of the carbon border adjustment mechanism and encourage the EU to go for it. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Virginia has an interesting experience with climate-related issues. This is a hearing that's focused on sea level rise and the oceans, but the Hampton Roads area of Virginia is about the second most vulnerable to sea level rise. That's a combination of sea level rising and land subsidence that's driven by aquifer reduction, and it is causing very serious issues. The other part of Virginia that really is seeing significant climate effects is at the opposite end of the state in Appalachia, where Appalachia is a coal mining area, so it's traditionally been a producer of fossil fuels in the coal mines. But Appalachia also, as you know, the topography is really dramatic with very steep, narrow valleys. And what we're seeing is rainfall that on an annual basis isn't changing that much, but it's just coming more episodically, violently, unpredictably. And when you have built infrastructure in these narrow hollers, you know, a road that can barely hug to the level right next to the stream, or a school that you can wedge in, the infrastructure has been built based upon a more kind of normal rainfall pattern, and as rainfall gets spikier than we've had, and the same has been true in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. We've had really significant damage of infrastructure because of episodic rain events. So it's kind of interesting that the two parts of my state that are affected the most are the area that has traditionally produced coal, seeing violent rain events that hurt people, home, infrastructure, and then the Hampton Roads coastal area. Hampton Roads is probably second to New Orleans in the degree of risk from sea level rise. The sea level around Hampton Roads is already 14 inches, then it was higher in 1950. And just during my 30 years in public life in Virginia, I've seen dramatic changes in Hampton Roads. Neighborhoods that might have experienced flooding 2-3 times a year now experience flooding from storm surges, and sometimes not even from storms, just from high tides, you know, multiple times a month. This affects homes, it affects businesses. It has a pretty significant effect on our military base. The main road into the Norfolk Naval Base, largest base in the world, is inundated fairly often. I've been frustrated, and I know the chair has too, that we've not been able to do what I would consider, you know, climate change legislation that focuses on causes and prevention. But it's not to say that we don't do climate change legislation. Every time we do an emergency supplemental to do hurricane relief, Superstorm Sandy or something like that, it's dealing with climate effects. Every time we have to rewrite the flood insurance programs and get more federal support and subsidy for that, I mean, it's sort of climate change research. So we're willing to, legislation, we're willing to do climate change on the back end. I'm glad that in bills like the Inflation Reduction Act and others, we're now starting to make investments around adaptation, but I understand the thrust of the testimony is that's not enough. Here's a particular effect that I wanted to ask Dr. Dutton about. In Hampton Roads, the sanitation district is really concerned about sea level rise and its effect on wastewater and groundwater. They're a national leader in water reuse that's called the SWIFT program, and it replenishes dwindling groundwater supplies to fight sea level rise by reducing the rate of land subsidence. But for rural, underserved, financially stressed communities, and a number in Hampton Roads fit the financially stressed side, where they have wastewater infrastructure that's primarily septic tanks and drainage field, septic system failures brought in by sea level rise are very challenging and very, very costly. So, Dr. Dutton, could you talk about the economic impact that sea level rise might have for the nation's water infrastructure?
Yes, thank you, Senator Kaine, for this question. I think when people think about sea level rise, they think the only risk is from your home getting flooded, right, the actual inundation of the land. But it is a threat to the water supply, the aquifer itself, that becomes salinized, which is a huge issue. Yes, you can build a desalinization plant, but they're very expensive and hugely energy intensive, right, which doesn't help either. But as you mentioned, also sewage is a big issue. Septic tanks that become corroded from the salt water, right, can fail as sea level rise and that water becomes more saline. Also the sewer pipes. So the sunny day flooding, coastal flooding that we have. It turns out, I learned on one of my early trips to South Florida, thinking about this issue, I talked to the Deputy Director of Water and Sewer who said, well, you know those sewer pipes are leaky. And I'm like, what do you mean they're leaky? Well, they're not built to withstand the water pressure of groundwater rising above them, right? And so what happens is that sewage leaks into the water. So on this sunny day flooding, when you're walking through the water, people have tested the water and there's high levels of E. coli in there. Right? So this becomes an immediate health issue in all these communities on our coastline that are getting this sunny day flooding from either high tides or these rainstorm events where it can't run off, which brings me to my last point on this, which is stormwater runoff. Right? Once sea level rises, those are gravity-fed systems, and that stormwater has nowhere to go. And so you see now flooding that's happening not even on high tide days, but just days where you get a lot of rain because those systems can't work and drain as they're designed to do anymore.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I would take another, Chairman, 30 seconds just to mention the phrase that Dr. Fraser used, which I think is very pertinent to this conversation, and which I had not heard before, of compound flooding. Compound flooding when the rainstorm from a storm is pouring down and causing the rain flooding, and at the same time, the storm has raised sea level rise with storm surge and that convergence. So compound flooding, new term for me. Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panelists as well. Now, it may surprise you that someone from New Mexico is showing interest in a hearing pertaining to warming oceans, specifically to how the climate crisis is threatening ocean industries.
You used to have a coastline just a couple of million years ago.
Yes, sir. I'm going to let that go, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to going to jump down that area.
And I'll reset your clock, so I'm not wasting your time.
I was very proud to introduce a piece of legislation with Senator Blackburn to improve access to the fastest computers in America, to help us better understand the ocean models, to build advanced models, namely working with the Department of Energy. Now, this effort will result in better forecasts of extreme ocean events and support a new generation of weather and climate models. The challenge of rapidly changing ocean conditions requires further research and development using tools like cutting-edge supercomputers and AI. Ocean industries like fisheries and tourism need accurate forecasts to be able to plan ahead for the next day's weather and adapt to changing seasonal ocean patterns. And we all rely on National Weather Service forecasts for our livelihoods, and I'm proud to support the service's collaboration with the Department of Energy National Labs already. I want to see it improve and see that access dramatically change. Now, Dr. Dutton, yes or no, has climate change made historical weather patterns a less reliable basis for weather forecasting?
Yes, that's correct.
And Dr. Dutton, yes or no, would advanced models that better predict the rapidly evolving ocean conditions help businesses and communities adapt to climate change?
100%, yes.
And Dr. Dutton, is there more that Congress can do to help ocean industries use better forecasts of extreme ocean events as they adapt to a warming ocean?
That's a great question. Captain Schaefer might be better able to explain how that information gets transferred to the people who need to use it out on the seas, actually.
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Is there more that Congress can do to help ocean industries use better forecasts of extreme ocean events as they adapt to a warming ocean?
Thank you for the question, and I think absolutely. Science and data drive not only management of our fish stocks, but the health of our oceans, and so I would say absolutely.
I appreciate that. Now, as I understand it, better forecasts of ocean conditions would benefit all of us, not just those in the ocean industry. All of us, and especially those of us in the Southwest, need better forecasts of El Nino to help us prepare for the extreme weather that drives the devastating wildfires and flash flooding like we saw recently in 2022. Alternating drought and heavy rainfall have impacted New Mexican agriculture, recreation, livelihoods. We depend on the snowpack for recreation, but also to ensure that our surface water, irrigation, agricultural way of life exists. Improving our ocean modeling capabilities isn't just important for protecting our ocean economies. New Mexico communities and businesses also depend on these models for accurate rainfall predictions. Now, Dr. Dunn, yes or no, do the extreme ocean cycles that are harmful to ocean industries also impact inland states like New Mexico?
Yes, and you mentioned one, El Nino is a big one, right?
Dr. Sumela, yes or no? Do our communities and businesses in New Mexico experience economic costs from climate-induced extreme ocean warming?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And a follow-up question to that, would improved forecasts of weather and ocean conditions allow my constituents to plan for severe weather and save them money and potentially save lives?
Yes, sir.
I very much appreciate the calling of this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and what we have seen coming out of national institutions like the Department of Energy is their missions depend on climate, on the movement of what the wind's going to do or blow or the warming of those oceans, things of that nature. 2 years ago, when there was this extreme fire event in New Mexico, it started as a prescribed burn. For whatever reason, the weather forecast that the forest was using that day said that they could start this fire and all the rest. One thing that I've never figured out, Mr. Chairman, is on the little farm that I still call home, we'll go and we'll burn the brush from the acequia where the water's going to flow so that it's easier to clean and maintain, and it's an earthen structure that we clean by hand every year. The same day that that prescribed burn was started, that someone at NSF was told that the weather was okay, my brother called to actually burn the little ditch on our little piece of land and that little farm, and he was told no by our local fire station. This fire resulted in the largest fire in New Mexico's history, and subsequently, we've seen flooding that has been taking out the homes that many of the firefighters and first responders even saved. It's been devastating. And so I'm hopeful that more accurate data, more accurate models will help us all across America. And this is an area that I hope that we can all work together as well. But thank you for calling this important hearing.
Thank you. And to complete the circle that you mentioned of how problems in the ocean affect the New Mexico economy, and you mentioned the wildfire earlier, Captain Schaefer mentioned that his fishing business off of Maine was affected by the western wildfires, and the clouding and the smoke made it harder to spot the fish for his clients, and he had to, as I recall correctly, Captain, you had to cancel trips. Yes. Senator Van Hollen has joined us from the great oceanic state of Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony today. And I'm going to start with you, Captain Schaefer, because the rockfish, also known as striped bass, is the Maryland state fish. I know you mentioned it in your testimony. We are seeing declining habitat due to warming temperatures in the Chesapeake Bay. And as you've noted, we've had less spawning success in recent years. Can you just elaborate a little more on your views of the impact of climate change on rockfish striped bass?
Absolutely, and thank you, Senator, so much for the question. I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, so it's great to be here and chat with you. So I've been guiding for striped bass in Maine for years, and I've noticed a steady decline. A lot of it's been kind of a conjunction of climate change and also management. Management is certainly something that we do have more control over to be more conservative in how we manage our fish stocks. But we've seen science over the past 5 years showing basically failed spawning events in the Chesapeake Bay, where 70% of the entire coastal stock for striped bass comes from the Chesapeake Bay and that estuary. And the science shows that it's been warm winters and low water has created an environment that hasn't been conducive for successful striped bass spawns. When you couple that with some management challenges, we're looking at a fisheries stock that has been steadily declining. Thankfully, I've been getting a little bit better at my job every year, but I have to work way harder to find fish and keep my clients happy, and I truly am facing a reality within the next few years that I may not be able to operate my charter business in Maine. And striped bass are a wonderful fish that have an economic impact all the way from North Carolina all the way up to Maine. So they're a big part of our culture and my livelihood.
Well, thank you for raising the alarm on this, and I'm seated, of course, next to Senator Kane, and between Maryland, Virginia, D.C., and the other Bay states, we do try to take seriously the fact that the Chesapeake Bay, as you said, is the spawning ground for this vital fish and many other fisheries. Dr. Dutton, you studied fossilized coral to understand past patterns of sea level rise and changing climate. There are those who argue that changes to climate are cyclical, that there are natural warming and cooling trends. You've argued that this warming period is different, noting, for example, that the Great Barrier Reef has withstood hundreds of thousands of years of warm periods and ice ages, but faces an existential risk now. Could you elaborate on the evidence that you see that points to climate change now being both man-made and tied to fossil fuels and impacting places like the Great Barrier Reef?
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator. So it's unlikely for scientists to use strong language like unequivocal, yet those are the types of words that you see scientists using to answer this question, is that it's unequivocal that humans are causing this warming. And we know that from many different ways, this very rapid warming, right? More rapid than anything we've seen in the geologic record, right, that I've studied. We know it from data, and we know it from models. So sometimes people are hesitant to trust the models, but we have a lot of data evidence too, right? We can look in many different ways, not just how much carbon dioxide has increased. We look at something called the isotopic composition of that carbon. It makes its way into the ocean. That isotopically different carbon even it turns up in the skeletons of these very corals that I study. And so we can see this trend of the fingerprint of fossil fuels in the atmosphere make its way into the coral skeletons over time. So this is telling us that's what's driving the increase in CO2. This is just one example that we have. And the models cannot reproduce that warming trend unless you put in human greenhouse gas emissions.
There's also, and you referenced this, sort of a new form of climate denial, which is acknowledging what's happening, but arguing that mitigation alone will be sufficient to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. What is your view of that argument? I think you've been clear on it, but I think it is worth emphasizing the points you've made.
Just a clarification for the record, I think you meant to say that adaptation alone will not.
Adaptation alone, exactly.
Right.
Sorry.
Yes. So the example I gave in my oral testimony was that we are already reaching the limits of threshold of survival of some of these species like corals that cannot just swim away and find the cooler water, so hence much more susceptible to dying. But in the context of sea level, right, we should talk about that. We can't just build a fortress on our coastlines where they are today. First of all, we wouldn't have enough money probably to do it around the entire United States. But the IPCC actually even refers to this as a maladaptation unless you are also planning for having those communities retreat out of harm's way, because eventually that wall will get breached, it will fail. We have seen this happen in New Orleans. We know what that looks like. We don't want to repeat that. So it's a temporary measure, right, to help us prepare. It buys us time. It's not a permanent fix, right? So we can't just engineer our way out of this problem. We actually know what's causing the problem. It's easier to mitigate, right, and to reduce our emissions.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Senator Padilla has joined us. Let me add one little data point here, because my friend Senator Johnson mentioned that he believes $5 trillion has been spent on climate change, trying to address it. I can't vouch for that number. It's his number. But I would put it in the context of Deloitte, which is a pretty well-known corporate consulting firm that hires a lot of very smart and able people and puts its reputation behind its public reporting. Deloitte has projected that if we do nothing about climate change, the cost to global GDP will be $178 trillion negative, that if we hit net zero by 2050, that will create $43 trillion in added GDP globally for a $220 trillion swing between getting this right and getting this wrong. So that's like the zettajoules, that's a pretty darn big number, and I wanted to add that to the record. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I'm very proud of California's leadership in this space, and so let me also offer a couple of data points. California's blue economy employs over 1 million people and generates $143 billion annually. However, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and ocean warming are increasingly threatening this booming sector. As our changing climate continues to warm the Earth's oceans and atmosphere, the phenomena we now refer to as atmospheric river events are becoming longer, wetter, and more severe. I'm not even referencing last winter's storms. I'm talking about just this week, San Diego, second largest city in California, one of the largest cities in America, having to declare a state of emergency after an atmospheric river brought a record rain of 3 inches in 3 hours, and flooding that left hundreds of families seeking shelter from the storm. A research team at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California found atmospheric river storms caused $1 billion annually in flood damages, not just in California, I'm talking about across 11 Western states. So it's not just a California concern, it's a regional and national concern, which could triple, by the way. The damage could triple by the end of the century. My question is for Dr. Dutton. Can you expand on your testimony about how sea level rise is increasing coastal flooding frequency?
Yes. So this is a really important question, so thank you for asking it. Oftentimes when people are planning for sea level, they look at projection curves to understand, how much time do we have until it gets to a certain level, say like 2 feet above sea level. And so if you're planning, I have 3 decades till we get there, we don't need to worry about it, that's actually the wrong takeaway from that graph, because what's going to happen is you'll have high tide flooding events like you see at Hampton Roads will become more frequent, and you'll reach that 2 feet more frequently, first 1 time a year, then 5, then 10. People who are living at that level are not going to wait until 3 decades when it's there on average, right? So the tolerance for sea level hitting that point will come much sooner than is implied if you're just looking at that sea level curve. And that would be true not just for California, but all over.
And so, given that, less time to prepare, less time to adapt.
That's right.
Less time to insure, less time to build better, et cetera, in so many places that hadn't experienced this dynamic before. I do want to raise another area for conversation. In 2016, the Port of San Diego in California launched their Blue Economy Incubator Program to help launch sustainable blue tech companies. To date, the port has funded 9 pilot projects ranging from stormwater monitoring to contaminant remediation to shellfish nurseries. University of California, San Diego also hosts an accelerator program called Start Blue, which provides small ocean technology business trainings, mentorship, and funds, access to capital. Dr. Somaila, what are some other examples of ways people have successfully leveraged public-private investments to finance a sustainable blue economy, and how can the federal government further incentivize similar investments?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question, because in all this, finance and economics is so central. You can see the discussion. And if you look around the world, there are efforts being made by groups, even financial companies, to work with communities to develop special vehicles to try to make finance accessible, especially to the most vulnerable groups in the world, the communities, indigenous people. And there is one group that I've been working with in Singapore, and their leader, she's a lady, she created this financing vehicle to support women in Asia and around the world to deal with climate change and other issues related to climate impacts. So I see quite a number of them around the world. So and California can definitely lead the world as usual, as the examples you've given shows. Yeah.
Any recommendations for what this committee can do or Congress can do for federal incentives for similar programs?
Yeah, you see, I think one of the ways the federal government can do, we talk a lot about money and trade-offs and cost and benefits. The thing is, at the moment, we really pump in a lot of public funds to subsidize fuel, which actually leads to more climate change. I think there is a big potential there to recoup some of these subsidies and turn them around to support communities and innovators to try to move us forward. And we're talking about trillions of dollars going to the oil and gas industry alone in terms of subsidies, public funds. My thing about subsidies is, please, let's use public funds to support people and the environment rather than use them to undermine the environment, which then goes to hit our people and make their lives conditions bad. So that is one potential place to get resources for incentives.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Let me thank so many colleagues for attending. Let me thank the witnesses for a truly, I think, useful and important hearing. We are terrestrial beings, we humans, and we tend to overlook what is going on in the oceans and the scale of it. When you're talking about zettajoules of heat, when you're talking about 7 Hiroshima-sized atomic detonations worth of heat per second being added to the oceans, you can expect very, very significant outcomes, and they will not be good ones. And so I appreciate this panel of witnesses for bringing those to our attention. I'll close with a story, a book I read not too long ago called Ship of Gold in a Deep Blue Sea, I think, which is a little bit of a morality tale for where we are. This was a ship bringing people home from the California gold rush who had made their fortunes, and the ship was full of ingots and gold bars and people who'd become rich and, very happy, and they came up the Carolina coast and came into a very big ocean storm, and the ship began to founder. And so they took action. They stopped service in the dining room. They put the stewards to work in the pumps. They began to throw furnishings overboard. Ultimately, they took the passengers and put them to work in the pumps. They began destroying structure on the boat to throw it overboard, and they ended up throwing gold bars overboard to try to save the boat. They did everything that they could, and everything that they did was just too late. And so the boat sank. And the second half of the story is the recovery of the gold, but how the ship sank when the crew and the passengers did everything that they could, but just did it all a little bit too late, ultimately throwing gold bars over the side to try to save their lives. I think that's a pretty good analogy for the situation that we are in right now. And the one thing that I would point out, because there are lots of people who say we should slow down and analyze, if they had slowed down to analyze what the effect would be of throwing this sofa overboard in terms of how many inches of freeboard you gained before they threw the sofa overboard, if they had stopped to do a study of what it would add to add passengers to the crew, to crank the pumps in the boat and stop doing stuff while those studies took place, that boat would have sunk a lot sooner. And again, I think those are two of the climate lessons for us. We have to really get after this. Time is not on our side. We are behind the curve, and studying around what we already know to be true is a fool's errand. So thank you to the witnesses for being here. The record will remain open for a week for any additional questions for the record. And with that, the hearing is concluded. Thank you.